is Marcus Dyck. I'm the current polar bear biologist for the government of Nunavut. I started this position probably about 8-9 months ago, and it's a very interesting job. It's definitely never dull, never boring. It's challenging for sure all the time. But one thing that I found to a certain degree is a little bit disheartening is what you see in the media and how media sometimes presents certain issues, what's happening with polar bears, or how certain individuals use polar bears for certain objectives, or what sometimes the animal rights groups and activists portray in the media. And what I'd like to do is, I'd like to welcome you on a little journey to Nunavut and to our polar bear management system, and how we manage polar bears, how we do research in Nunavut on polar bears, how we also have Inuit involvement in some of the research, and what the current status is of polar bears according to our latest research. So before I start actually with the real presentation and go into the meat and bones, I think we heard a little bit already about Nunavut, but I think only a very small number of people that are here in this room probably only had a chance to go to Nunavut and actually live there, work there on polar bears. So I'll give you a little bit of information and background. So this is Nunavut, what you have in gray, and that's one of the latest territories. Where's my pointer? There we go. So this is Nunavut's latest Canada's latest territory. It was established in 1999. And it has, obviously, just like any other place like Norway or like the rest of Canada, has beautiful spaces, lots of glaciers, fjords, oceans. Here are some examples. It's just magnificent. And when you look further and closer at it, there's about 25 communities that are dispersed throughout Nunavut. The capital is Iqaluit. The largest city, which is Iqaluit, is about 6,700 people, according to the latest polls. The smallest community is only about 130 people. The mean from all the communities is about 870. And what's also important is that the majority of Nunavut is traditional, is Inuit. So 85 to 86% is Inuit people that live in Nunavut. Here's an example of a community in the spring. That's Grise Fjord. That's Iglulik. There's just a couple of scenic shots. Here's Pond Inlet, so you have an idea for the setting. But I think it's also important to understand where we are, who the people are that we're working with, and challenges that we face, but still take into account what great job that we do with our conservation efforts and monitoring efforts. Clyde River. And Nunavut obviously also has a vast amount of history, right? So there's all these traditional places from the Thule, the pre-Dorset, and the Dorset. So all around Nunavut, you find some of these old sites. There's a lot of traditional living. It's not like Paris, right? A lot of people still go camping and hunting. We've seen some of these slides before in previous presentations. So traditional living and the traditional way of life is very, very alive, and it's part of everyday life. Then traditional methods are still used today like they were hundreds of years ago. This lady is using some down, that's down in Sunny Kilowatt, and they're still plugging the ducks and the idle ducks and the geese, and they're using the down, they're making certain clothes out of it, and it's still used like it was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Same with summer camps where people spend sometimes 5-6 months or longer just staying in camps, right? And they're not going back to communities, or very rarely to the communities. And Nunavut obviously is also home to the very loyal and powerful Canadian Inuit dog and the sled dog. And it was mentioned again earlier in the presentation, the dog is also a very special place in Inuit tradition, and also when it comes to living in communities, living on the land, and living with bears. Nunavut's also the place where a lot of wildlife species can still roam freely. There are not many roads, there are very few fences. Any wildlife that you see is wild. Nunavut is a place, when you leave your house in the morning and you go on the land, you might be dead by lunchtime. And that's reality. That sometimes happens. So it's still a wild place where you really have to know what you're doing. You really have to understand the environment, the wildlife, and most people that live there, they do. So we have muskox, for example, right? We have seals, and obviously Nunavut's also home to polar bears. Nunavut's actually home to most of Canada's polar bears. And some of these wildlife species that I just showed you here on the slides, they're not just wildlife species to look at or take pictures at. These are species that are still consumed. As I said, Nunavut is a very traditional society, and that is meat, that is traditional meat with a lot of protein, with a lot of vitamins. It's healthy, it's affordable, because we can't just go around the corner and go to some little tiny store and buy our pork chops or buy some ground beef. And if you actually have the luxury, sometimes it's just too expensive. So people prefer traditional food, and these animal species, besides many others, they end up on a table, right, because they're very nutritious. Then I thought, as a little comparison, and the key here is I'd like to just focus the attention to the area. I picked 11 European countries, and they're kind of an area very similar to the size of Nunavut, but look at the comparison with respect to population. Those countries have about 321 million people. The same area, Nunavut, that we have, they're about 34,000 people. And if you look at the density for the same area, taken on these European numbers, it would be 153 people per square kilometer, and the number is so small in Nunavut that it's like insignificant. If you turn it around, in Nunavut, one person would have about 56 square kilometers to themselves. And probably here in Paris, it's maybe the size of a shoebox or something, right? So keep these things in mind, how they relate to where we live, the work that we do, and the people and the wildlife that we're dealing with. We had already a couple of very interesting, oh, am I talking loud enough? Is that good? We had already a couple of interesting presentations. I'm drying up here because the temperatures that you have here is like my summer months that I have in Igloolik. So I left at probably close to 2 feet of snow already and minus 15, so I'm dying as I need to drink water a little bit. But I'm glad that we had some of these presentations that involved already some history of bears, perceptions of polar bears. Obviously polar bears are in the media for various reasons lately. And we also looked at some of the perception how bears are used and in a way even manipulated to get certain messages out. So this is pretty much what you hear, what you see, what you read about, right? That polar bears are declining, they're endangered due to no sea ice because of climate change. Then because there's no sea ice, or there's less sea ice and it melts earlier, polar bears have to swim, right? And they have to swim for their lives. They have to swim for longer distances now. And some of them are not lucky. Some of them just drown. I didn't warn you about some offensive or graphic images because I thought mine were graphic, but Remy already had some pictures and the other presentations had some pictures, so I thought whatever I show is probably even toned down, so I didn't mention anything. So another image or some other messages that you probably hear is that polar bears in desperation kill themselves and resort to cannibalism because, again, the time on the sea ice is too short and they just start to eat themselves now. Polar bears in the 80s were really fat. And now they're skinny because they just don't have enough time to eat or catch seals on the sea ice, or they spend more time on shore now, so they're just dying, they're starving. Because there's less sea ice, people say there's more bears now in communities, and communities are overrun with polar bears, and that's why you have them in garbage dumps. Because they're starving, they try and find food at communities. Or then you have some other images and posters that are prepared by some animal activists and animal rights groups that portray that polar bears are pretty much only a dollar sign, and every bits and piece of them is sold on the market. And the traditional people that utilize everything and not sell it, but it's used for clothes, it's for meat, it's for sharing, there's tradition, there's mythical stuff, that Inuit people probably only look at every single dollar sign that's on a banner, on every body part that's there. So these messages are really powerful, that some of the media and that other organizations are using to get their messages across. And this is another one here that I saw in May, that a rich Chinese thrill seekers paying $50,000 for a trip of a lifetime to kill endangered polar bears. Things like this, when I'm in a position as a polar bear biologist, really irk me, because if you read some of these reports, there's absolutely no fact-checking from some of the journalists. There's, at some points, exaggeration. And when it comes to accountability of the media and journalism, it's almost next to none. It's very little. And when people look at Nunavut, we're constantly under the microscope. Nunavut's constantly criticized for the work or not for the work they're doing, but who's scrutinizing the media? So what I like to do is, as I mentioned earlier, I want to like to take you on a little journey and show you what we actually do. And this is a reality check of what's actually happening. And you hear this now from us, where we live with polar bears, we live with traditional people, we live in the communities. I live in Nunavut, I live in a community. So this is what we see and this is what we observe. And this is not what you just hear somewhere. The other thing I also would like to ask the audience, and I know when I went to university, I had a lot of good instructors and professors that told me, read something, but use your brain and read it critically and go through a little process to figure out where's the information coming from. Why is the information portrayed in a certain way? And I think what humanity has lost in the last 5 or 10 years is using their brain and just reading something critically, because everything that's presented, that's on the internet or it's somewhere available in digital format or is on the internet, it's got to be true, right? So just, I think that's a very important message here. This is probably just a repetition for most people that are here. There are 5 polar nations, the range states. We have Russia, the United States, Norway, Greenland, and Canada. And there's 19 recognized populations of polar bears, of which 13 subpopulations are within Canada, or they're shared with Canada. And when we look at Nunavut, we have 12 polar bear subpopulations. And it's kind of hard to see here with the red, but you see the outline of Nunavut here. And all the populations that are circled in red, these are populations that Nunavut shares with different jurisdictions. So it's also important to recognize that we're not working just in a vacuum. We're working with other jurisdictions together for the conservation and the monitoring and the conservation of the species. Remy had a very interesting slide in his presentation. I really liked that one when he talked about the history of polar bears and how whalers and sealers came and how polar bear hunts actually increased. And you can go actually up to 1930, and if you go through some historic records, then you probably find that between 1892 and about 1930, almost 55,000 polar bears were harvested, mostly by whalers, mostly by sealers, mostly by explorers, and a relatively small proportion only by the Inuit population. So that concern of harvest and overharvest, that concern pretty much made this international agreement on the protection of polar bears happening, because there was overharvest of polar bears in Norway. There were other countries that had very high harvests of polar bears. And there was a concern that probably only worldwide at this time, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 polar bears were still around. And for that reason, that agreement was signed by the range states to make sure conservation of polar bears is guaranteed. Every party is doing their part and their portion of that work, and the habitat's also protected. There's a couple of other legislation points that I have here. All I want to show with this slide here is that we have international agreements that Canada has to obey, but there's also national, and there's also some checks and non-government bodies like the Committee on the Status of Endangered Species and Wildlife, that we have these organizations that also help in governing and making conservation happen in Canada with respect to polar bears. So polar bear research and management in Nunavut consists pretty much out of two parts. We have co-management, and I call the other part population ecology, or we call it polar bear research. You can call it anyway. It's the research and the ongoing work that we do. Now, for those that are not familiar with the land claim, this baby traveled all the way from Nunavut to Paris. Here's the Nunavut land claim. This is a very important document that gives Inuit their rights to harvest, as it's listed here, that there are no undue restrictions to harvest. The principles of conservation. This document was negotiated for many, many years between Inuit and the federal government, and anything that's going on in Nunavut that happened, which organizations should be established, their roles, their duties, their responsibilities, everything is in this document. And you can go online sometimes and take a look and see how comprehensive it is. It's probably the most comprehensive land claim right now in existence. And it's probably a role model for other Inuit organizations also to follow kind of like this outline of this land claim. So this land claim is a very important document. And there's an Article 5 in there that just deals with wildlife. And as I said, Inuit have the right to harvest. The principles of conservation have to be adhered. And one of the important things is that also Inuit Kaumiatuhangi has to be included, which is traditional Aboriginal knowledge, and science at the same time. And based on these different these backgrounds from Western science and traditional knowledge, and the different roles and responsibilities of the organizations that we have in Nunavut, we have a co-management system where all partners sit around a table and all partners are involved, and every partner has specific roles. So this is very important. We have one body, one board that's called the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board that has very specific roles with respect to wildlife management. Ultimate authority is given to the government of Nunavut with our department, but we also have hunter organizations, we have regional wildlife organizations that are all involved just as the same as the other two parties in this co-management aspect are involved. And this is a little bit more complicated. Just for you as an overview how the co-management system is set up in Nunavut, where we have, again, the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, we have regional wildlife organizations, and these organizations are set up with hunters, with elders, with people that have skills, that have knowledge that has been passed on from generation to their generation, that they contribute by being on the board, by making decisions, by sitting down with Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, which is also an organization that ensures that Inuit rights are followed and adhered to all the time. So they're involved in some of the processes. You have the government of Nunavut involved in these processes, and you have hunters and trappers involved in the whole process. So when we do research, we do consultations, we do intensive consultations with the communities. We go and talk to hunters, we prepare certain research proposals, or if there's some environmental assessment impact statements, there's always hunters, local, regional organizations involved, the Wildlife Management Board is involved, and it's not just somebody makes a decision, there's part of a negotiation where you give a little, you take a little, but you sit down, and hopefully you have an open mind, and you look beyond some of the differences, and that you look at the good, what comes out of it, that you have a better tomorrow, and that you sit down and make good, solid decisions based on science and based also on Aboriginal traditional knowledge. And of course, we also take, as was mentioned earlier by Terry, that we also take hunter and trappers, not only young ones, there's usually also elders that want to come out. So we take them out for research projects, and we sit around and we discuss the research projects with them. Then with respect to polar bear research and management, when it comes to the aspect of the research, there are the very different aspects that we in principle follow. We need, and I don't want to go into all the research detail, but we do population delineations that gives us an idea which area does the population actually occupy. Then we have that as an area that we can bound, and we know that's the area we have to look for the animals that use this specific area, and we can look for individuals within to get an abundance estimate. Then, depending on the research that's going on, we can use population availability, population viability analysis, or we have repeated monitoring aspects. So that is flexible depending on the work that has been done in the past. And all this information comes together with the quota, what is commonly known here. We call it in Nunavut, it's the total allowable harvest, and it kind of is synonymously used for quota, and how the harvest management works. So these are all pretty much the day-to-day activities that are going on in our offices. So we start with our population delineation, and this is an older example from Davis Strait. Right, so what we have up here, we have collars, we have the bears walk around, use the collars for a year or 2 years, depending on how long the battery life is, and we get movement patterns, and based on these movement patterns, we can delineate the area that they occupy. After that, some form of enumeration is done, and you have, I'm too loud. Oh, I'm sorry. For the translator, okay. I'm sometimes getting too passionate about this and too fast, sorry. So then we have enumeration. Not necessarily is this program used, but there are certain computer programs that aid the biologists in getting specific vital rates, getting specific statistics that we can use in making some abundance estimate. Then again, in certain instances, we can also make some predictions for the future with respect to the population viability. And some of this information obviously is needed if we want to try and establish a total allowable harvest or a quota. But that's not it. We're not just calculating what's the population growth rate, what is sustainable, and then we just take this number and we take this number as the quota or divide it somehow up. There's a lot more involved in this. Right? We have the future projections. We look at some of the population trends and population size, but we also look at public opinions, traditional knowledge. We sit down and we have meetings with the Wildlife Management Board. We have meetings and consultations with our local hunters. What do the hunters think? Are these bears actually more abundant, less abundant? Do the numbers kind of jive with our estimates? Is there something that's completely opposite that's going on? What's happening with the environment? Any specific environmental threats or trends that also are reported to us from Inuit that see these things when they're traveling on the land? And also the past quota or the past TAH is taken into account. And when we take all this into account, then we determine what could be or should be a sustainable level of males and females, and our system in Nunavut currently is a sex-biased ratio where we harvest 2 males for 1 female. And this number is the quota. And this quota goes to the community. So there's probably some answers to some of the questions that some of you had previously. So there's a number that's given to a community, and this number historically has been determined what these people harvested, what the communities harvested 50, 60, 70 years ago. So even if you look at what some of the quotas are now, they're not that much different depending on the area. So we're actually, with our quota system, for more or less, we're still kind of following what historically has been harvested in some of those communities. And this quota, or these tags that eventually the community obtains, they can use these tags either for a regular hunt, or a beneficiary goes out hunting, or they can divide it up into regular hunt and sport hunt. So whatever happens with a sport hunt is still within the quota. A lot of people misunderstand that, oh, there's sport hunts and all of a sudden the quota is going up and there's too many bears are being shot. It doesn't really matter if a bear gets shot as part of a regular hunt or if it's part of a sport hunt. It doesn't matter with respect to the quota. What's really important here is to understand that Nunavut's also challenged with social issues. And if you have a sport hunt that can bring in up to $30,000 to a community, and where you can employ 8 or 9 people in your community that can clean the skins, be the guide, have the dog team, cut up the meat, do all these things, this is big time employment. So losing a sport hunt is like for you losing a job and not getting paid for a year. So it's very important. So having sport hunts is really important to the communities. And the system of these quotas and the system of the TAH and having this co-management system, that it works, you see it right here on this graph. When you look at the skidoo that just flew in there, around 1962 is when the snowmobile arrived in the high Arctic. And as soon as the snowmobile arrived up there, polar bears were a lot easier accessible, and bears were shot quite a bit. There was a concern in the NWT, and because of that, quotas were initiated. So when you see when we initiated quotas in about 1968, there were quotas established, but follow the line of the quota, which is the blue one, and look at the numbers of polar bears harvested. You see that the numbers of polar bear harvested probably in 99.9% of the time is always less than what the quota is. So our hunters follow not only the quota system really well and the reporting system, but also follow with their traditions of what they harvested, right? So the system is working really well. This graph shows you just a quick overview of the polar bear quota, which is the blue line, and the total harvest is the red line, and then the proportion of the sport hunt in the total harvest. And you have the season on the x-axis, the y-axis on the left is the number of bears. That refers to the quota and the polar bear harvest, and the right axis is the proportion of the sport hunt. So you see that it doesn't really matter how many sport hunts you have. It does not affect the quota, right? The quota is still the same, whatever is given, so it does not have a major effect. The other important point here, I think, that needs to be made is with sport hunts and with the respect to CITES, there's only a very small proportion of polar bear parts that actually enter the international trade. So having sport hunts or making a claim that the trade would have an impact on polar bear population abundance, to my mind, is just ridiculous. It's just completely the wrong forum to address these kind of things. And governments and individuals sometimes use these different metaphors that people can use, but they're using a forum like CITES really just to show that, oh, we're trying to do something, but pack the bull by the horn. Go to the governments and deal with climate change and gas emissions. That is the key issue here. And even major organizations like World Wildlife Fund, PBSG, and other organizations, and even within the submission from the United States to the Endangered Species Act, they haven't even really been claiming or listing that trade is a major concern for the conservation of the polar bear species. So trade is really not an issue, I think, when it comes to conservation. The last little aspect that we have that I pretty much do day by day with my staff, we have a harvest management program, and with the harvest management program, we get samples that are mandatory under the Wildlife Act and the wildlife regulations, and they require tooth aging. We collect teeth. There's certain measurements that we require. There are tissue samples. We measure some of these samples. We use some of these tissue samples for other research, and we also get ear tags and tattoos back that we can also get an idea about tags and recovery of tags, which helps us in analyzing some of the vital rates like mortality for some of the individuals. Besides that, we also try and do education. We educate our hunters, we educate our conservation officers. The conservation officers are our link in the community. They're our liaison, so we try and work with them very, very closely, and they go to the hunters and explain what's happening with the polar management system, How does the quota system work? Why do we only have to harvest this? Why can't we harvest that? So this is part of our day-to-day job as well. And I get usually a lot of emails just from hunters or from the Hunters and Trappers organization who have common questions, and they'd like to get them answered. And we work with them very closely on this part as well. I need to shrink. So besides these regular ongoing activities, we also engage in research activities, and here's an example of some newer ongoing research activities that we have been conducting. It is a big variety. Obviously, contaminants is a big issue. For habitat, feeding ecology, different population estimates that we work in, body condition and stress and growth and development. We also try and collect some information and work with people on ice conditions, traditional knowledge. We have a social scientist within our department who is collecting constantly information relevant to the populations that we're working with. He's traveling to communities, conducts consultations, and we also comment on environmental impact statements and assessments that are produced from various organizations or different developers. And overall, if we work with different universities, the government, other jurisdictions, we pretty much spend up to $1 million, sometimes more, $1 million a year. And I mentioned earlier, there's only 33,000 people living in Nunavut. And we have tons of bears in Nunavut. And there are social issues. And there are a lot of other things that make Nunavut very unique. Spending $1 million showing this commitment almost year after year after year, I think, is a clear sign that the government and the biologists and the people of Nunavut and the co-management partners are clearly dedicated to monitoring and to conducting research. These are a couple of examples of our recent research efforts. This is a collaborative work that we're doing with Greenland. That's Kane Basin. That's a small population. You see it on this map here. Kane Basin is right up here between Greenland and Ellesmere Island. And what we're doing there is we're just conducting research. We put collars out, we put some spot tags out, and we go into the first steps of population delineation, right? We want to know how is the abundance of bears in this area, and there was some concern about overharvest, and Greenland Inuit and Nunavut Inuit and the governments got together and said there's a potential concern, let's address this, let's work together collaboratively, and they had this MOU of understanding, and we started work in 2012 for Kane Basin. So this is some of the area where we already have some movement and some of the search patterns in Kane Basin. The neighboring population is Baffin Bay. This is also shared between Greenland and Canada or Nunavut. And similar, there were some concerns with respect to harvest levels or population abundance, and we heard different stories from Inuit in different communities. So concern on both sides of Baffin Bay, and we included Baffin Bay and Kane Basin within that collaborative effort where people, researchers on the Greenland side, cover the area along the shores and look for bears, and we do our part in Nunavut. The work that's done there is actually something very interesting too, because we have been, to some degree, and I hate sometimes to be lumped by organizations into the same category than biologists down south, because I live in Nunavut, I deal with communities in Nunavut, and I try to listen to the community members and the concerns they have. So the concerns that were brought forward to our government and our department was, well, you don't respect traditional values and how we deal with wildlife, and you should try and come up with something different. So we sat down and we looked around, or colleagues of mine looked around. When I say we, I talk about our department. And we've tried DNA biopsy sampling. So this is a less invasive or non-invasive technique where we still get IDs, identification, which is the DNA marker from the individual, and that we can still try and work with to get population estimates. And the Kane Basin and Baffin Bay is kind of the pilot projects. We've done smaller projects in different populations to see how this technique potentially works. We were satisfied. Inuit communities were satisfied. They asked us to try and use it and see how far we can get with this. And now we're using it for the last 2 slides that I showed you on Cane Basin and Baffin Bay. And the good thing is, the animal is not immobilized anymore, and Inuit also had a concern, well, if you immobilize the animal, it tastes weird. I mean, would you like to go to the store and buy a big hunk of meat, knowing that there are some drugs maybe in there or not? You want something that's pure, right? So that was a concern that we listened to as well. So that's why we're trying this non-invasive DNA sampling. Then we also have worked with other jurisdictions on populations that we share with aerial surveys. And the Southern Hudson Bay population is one of those. We just finished that last fall, or actually last month. That's another work that was completed where we just released some research results this year. This is probably one of the populations that you know about the most, right? Western Hudson Bay, because everything that comes with climate change and polar bears are going extinct and the ice is gone and you see these pictures of polar bears tippy-toeing on this little tiny chunk of ice. It comes to the most part from this population, Western Hudson Bay, and there is another population that's also used for this image of polar bears are going extinct. So for this population between the late 80s and up to 2004, the population had declined between 1,200 down to 935. That's what scientists have found. And we listened to what scientists have told us, we talked to our communities, and we said, well, this population very likely is going down into the basket. And predictions, even without harvest, indicated that this population probably would go very close to extinction. So we as the government, where we live with Inuit, where we have to deal with Inuit all the time, we have to deal with some of the fallout that other individuals that make certain statements or present certain information, we have to deal with the after effects with the communities. So we negotiated certain quotas. We said, okay, we're going to try and obviously work with all the jurisdictions to make sure that we have conservation. A few years later, Inuits were telling us there's more polar bears in the areas, and we see more bears here, and we see more polar bears over here. And they asked us, we need to know, we think there are more bears in this population. And we didn't ignore that. We said, okay, au contraire to some other biologists, we actually studied the whole area that this population occupies. And what normally is occupied, or what normally is studied, is a small area in here that's a national park, and there are a couple of other pockets within that whole population boundary that is studied. But we actually studied the whole area for that population, and we divided the studies area up into different density areas. We did our aerial survey, which is also a different technique now that we also apply. So we've applied a second modern technique, right? So we get away from handling wildlife. And when the results were done, our estimates are about 1,000 bears that we have. So the decline that was predicted without harvest, for some reason, was not observed. And we also have to take into consideration that we had, for this time period from 2004 up to 2011, when we did this survey, we also had a moderate harvest, right? So, and it didn't look like statistically significant that the population estimates from before and now what we have is different. Fox Basin, we did another aerial survey. We just released some new results within this population too. Don't have to spend too much time on this. It just gives an idea how much work the department has done just in the last 3 or 4 years. There are multiple projects ongoing, multiple projects have been finished. There's a lot of work that's happening all over in different technique development, mark recapture, DNA sampling, consultations. So we're busy, busy, busy all the time. And when you take the latest information that we have into account, our research information, take our traditional knowledge into account, and we'll take a census of what's happening with the populations from a Nunavut perspective and the bears that we share with other jurisdictions. This is what we see in Nunavut, right? We see that we have 6 populations that look very much stable. We have 3 populations that look very much that they're increasing. We have 1 current population up in the North Norwegian Bay that is data deficient, and the Cane Basin and the Baffin Bay population are currently under investigation, and we have to wait until the last year of that research is done to make an assessment on those. So, if everything would have been really bad and what people are saying that polar bears are dying and they're going extinct, I think the green line that we see here in this graph very likely would have been different, right? The green line in this graph indicates is our total number of estimated polar bear abundance. And we have our quota in there again, and we have our harvest line in there. And the right side is the abundance of polar bears that we have in Nunavut. So I would have guessed, if I really have no clue about polar bears, and somebody would have told me in 2000 that they're going to go extinct and swimming and everything's happening, I would have expected that at least from 2000 to 2011, that line would have been constantly declining, right? When we look at the data availability that we have in Nunavut, and we take even published reports that are on websites that everybody can access, and we take our recent findings, we just don't see that trend. Okay, in conclusion. I think that in general, the public is poorly informed by the media, or is misinformed, either by activist groups, animal rights groups, other individuals that use polar bears for their own objectives and drive certain messages. And that hampers, I think, and also puts a damper on our status and management efforts in Nunavut. In effect, actually, doomsday prophets, as I like to call them, they overshadow the real efforts. And when you think about initially what happened with polar bears, why the international agreement was formed, it was because polar bears were over-harvested back then in the 60s, and there were only a few thousand bears left. So polar bears are a conservation success story if you look at the last graph, or second last graph, where we have about 13,200 or 13,400 polar bears in Nunavut. We have dedicated co-management partners in Nunavut. It's not always easy, but we always try and work together as much as we can, because we all have the same goal in mind, and they all play meaningful roles. We have an adaptive system. We have an adaptive system that includes our science, and it also includes traditional knowledge, Inuit Hawaiimayatuhangi. And our system is adaptive enough and flexible enough if we detect something, if our hunters and our elders tell us something, and we have from the regional organizations information that they think there's a conservation issue or a concern, we're flexible enough to address these issues within a very short time frame. We have an intense and very effective research and monitoring program. There are a lot more bears now than historically. I believe it. I've been traveling a lot throughout Nunavut. I've talked to a lot of hunters. I've talked to a lot of elders. And you can go even through some historic records. One problem is we can't really tell how many polar bears were there before 1892. Hard to say. Maybe there were like 60 or 70,000. We don't know. But given the historic numbers, where bears were initially around 6 to 7, 8,000 bears, up to where we are now, I think polar bears have been a great success story, and there are a lot more bears than there used to be. Which begs the question, how many bears are enough? And this is a philosophical question that I don't answer here. You can think about this. And think about this from the point of view that you're living here in Paris, and you're driving your sub, and you're driving your car, and your bicycle. Or think about that you're actually living where I'm living, where before I left, 2 days before I came to Paris, I had a polar bear in my backyard. So it's a different story, right? So how many polar bears are actually enough? When is conservation actually enough? Just to think. We have a very good and probably the best polar bear harvest monitoring system. Other jurisdictions are copying our system. We're helping different jurisdictions on populations that we share on how to collect the samples, how to set it up properly, and we assist them as much as we can, and we're more than happy to help them with some of these tasks. Am I still talking too fast? Good. We also developed non-invasive techniques, or further developed some non-invasive techniques, right? And we're probably not right on the forefront with this, but we've actually at least took a leap and took some of these risks to use new techniques. Where other jurisdictions are still stuck in the 1970s, we try to move ahead and incorporate best available knowledge in the scientific field, where we can use aerial surveys and this DNA sampling. So we're trying to advance this. We're still trying to listen to our elders and our communities, and if there are other techniques that are less invasive, that are more promising, we will try and use them. We'll try to apply them. They might not work for every population, right? And our communities understand that, but they might work for 2 or 3 populations because you have very specific characteristics that make it applicable. Other populations, there might be only one type that you can use, and that's it. Climatic changes. You can ask probably every Enoch in Nunavut what's going on with climate change and if they're concerned about it. I guarantee you, you can even chop my right hand off. There's not one Enoch who denies climate change. Right? We're not denying climate change. I'm not denying climate change. I've seen it. I've been in Churchill many years. I've seen how everything has changed there. I've lived in Nunavut for a long time. I've seen how things have changed up there. And I talk to hunters. We hear it. We're not concerned about what's happening 40, 50, 70 years down the road. We have to deal with a management system now. And as you've seen in some of the numbers, we don't have any issues right now with bears. There are more bears than ever. Our system is flexible enough to identify and work with some concern and conservation issues. And that's part of our management system, the co-management system. Again, that includes science and traditional knowledge. I've given you a couple of examples before, and I'm just reiterating this here. I don't think that any of the trade is wanting that polar bears should be uplisted, right? There's absolutely no criteria, and the Forum for Scientists is just not there. In case if people don't know what that means, uplisting polar bears are listed on Appendix 2 right now, and there's some trade, but if it goes to Appendix 1, that would mean that literally no polar bear hide or polar bear part can leave Canada and go somewhere. And that pretty much kills a lot of economic industries, and they're not really industries if you have a couple of dogs and a sled and a skidoo, but within communities, the economic efforts are drastically hampered. And that's also another issue that reflects back on how we try to work really close with communities, but all of a sudden, there are other players in the field, and if you have to deal with this uplisting, again, we are the ones who have to live with it. We're losing the faith and the trust of the people that we're working with, and we've tried to establish this over 10, 15, 20 years, and I'm just another generation of polar bear biologists who's in Nunavut, who's trying to work with communities. But all that trust, all that faith that you're trying to build with beneficiaries, it's going out the window with some of these things. And they're just saying, well, why the hell do we have to have conservation of polar bears if whatever we do is not working anyway because other people make the decisions for us? We will continue to manage polar bears responsibly. There's also this conservation aspect within the Nunavut land claim. And we want to try and ensure, of course, that we have viable populations, healthy populations, that they're maintained for future generations of hunters that we have in Nunavut, and maybe to other sport hunters that would like to come. I'd like to thank, and I forgot to start my presentation like that, I'd like to thank the organizers and Remy for giving us an opportunity here just to speak to you, present some information directly from Nunavut. I also like to thank the translators for doing a good job with my speak and dialect. The foundation as well to get us here. And some of these organizations that I've listed, I also have to thank my lab staff because Angela Coxon has done a lot of work, and Steve Atkinson also were very instrumental in some of the work. Thank you very much for your attention. That's the end of my talk. Thank you. Merci. Kuanami.